Fett.
Hello, everybody. Greetings. This is Fett here at Azalea Studios in Nashville. There's probably a whole lot of folks here that I already know. So it's great to be here at the 2020 virtual TAXI Road Rally. I get to do some really cool stuff I don't normally get to do in a hotel conference room setting, like show you stuff on my screen and play the audio and go through PowerPoint slides and stuff like that. So I am super duper psyched, A, that I get to do this from the comfort of my own studio, and B, that I get to do all this extra cool stuff with you. So with that in mind, welcome to everybody. Let's get right to it and have some fun. So for those of you who have been in my classes over the years at the road rallies and what have you, you know that I'm really into pro tips, pro techniques, pro secrets, and all that kind of stuff that actually make life simpler, not more difficult. And this class is no exception. So we're going to focus on the 5 primary mixing tools. And I recommend highly that if you have a chance, grab your headphones and listen to this class with your headphones on. Not because you won't be able to hear anything through normal speakers or however you normally do it. If you happen to be sitting in your home studio with your monitors in front of you, that's great. But if not, you might want to wear the headphones to hear some more of the subtleties, particularly when we start working with things like stereo spread and what have you. So just a little recommendation there before we get rocking. So here is a pro secret alert, since I'm big into pro secrets. All great mixes start with these 5 primary mixing tools. If we use them effectively, we can do fabulous mixes without any other help. And again, these are based on my 5 primary mixing tools in my Mixing Roadmap book and my Mixing Mastery online video course. But we're going to go into some detail right now on what those tools are. I'm not going to go through every one of them now on the screen, but we will go through them in turn during this class. And we'll also talk about an example of each one of them, so you can not only have a technique to try, but actually hear it happening on the screen. So we've got levels, we've got panning within the stereo field, we've got tone shaping, or usually we call that EQ or equalization. We've got compression and limiting, or as a general concept, dynamics control. And we have time-based effects like reverb and delay, and that also includes things like chorus and flange. Those 5 tools will get you 99% of all of your mixing done. With that in mind, let's rock. All right, so primary mixing tool number 1, simply, believe it or not, is volume levels. And what we start with is relative levels between each part at the start of the mix. So we want to have the drums at a certain level, and we want to have the guitar at its own level, and the keyboards and the vocal and whatever the case may be, right? Or if you're working on an orchestral mix, the different parts of the orchestra are going to start at certain relative levels to one another. And then we want to have changes in level to be part of that journey, that story, that flow, not only between the parts, like the guitar comes up when it does a solo and maybe the keyboard goes back a little bit, but also within a given part. You might have certain licks or certain phrases or certain parts of one of the instruments in the arrangement come up when that lick or special thing is played, and then go back again into the bed of the music, if you will, when it's not doing that kind of thing. But also between different sections of the songs. Of the song, you'll get louder, you'll get softer, you might go away. So volume levels also includes muting, by the way, not playing at all, having no volume, and that is a very, very good tool to use for that ebb and flow and keeping the listener interested. Just turn shit off. We don't have to have every single track that we recorded all the way through necessarily playing or singing all the way through when it comes to the mix. That takes a little discipline, but that mute button or that turning the volume all the way down to infinity can be a very, very useful tool if we can be disciplined enough to use it. And there we go. Sometimes no level is the best level. Alrighty, so the way we do this in today's tools, virtually every DAW out there, a digital audio workstation, or that's a fancy term for production or music software, has some notion of automation. Some more than others, but they almost all have basic volume automation where you can turn up and down the volume on a track as it's playing, and then it'll play back those volume changes every single time you push play on the mix. This is a godsend of a tool, and it used to be very, very expensive and really hard to do on consoles, and it's exceptionally hard to change on consoles once it was recorded. Nowadays, it's just a total piece of cake. So that is your number one tool and your best defense. So we want to get all those volume levels relative to one another to start in a really good place. Then we want those volume levels to change throughout the course of the mix as they're determined by the role of each part. Sometimes they're not there at all, and we can do all that through volume automation. And by the way, you can also automate muting on and off as well. So the pro secret for this class, for fader writing, I think is one of the absolute biggest differences between broadcast quality and non-broadcast quality. And this is literally just to do with volume levels. What I see people do is they do a ton of compression, too much compression, to get levels under control between the loudest and the softest parts of a part, rather than doing volume automation for some of that. I do a combination of compression and volume automation, which we're going to see, that to me gives me the most natural sounding result and the least amount of technology infusion into the process. Things don't sound processed. They don't sound too technical or too sterile when I combine compression with volume automation. We're going to talk a little bit more about compression later on. But this is especially true with vocals. People will squash the snot out of vocals with a compressor to get all the volume consistent, quote unquote, at the expense of the naturalness of the sound of the vocal and its role within the mix. So that's a very, very common thing I see in non-broadcast quality mixes. But not only for vocals, you can use this notion of volume fader writing, as we used to call it on consoles, because we turned the fader up and down in order to create that automation. This can happen on any part. That's partly how we create the emotional ebb and flow in a mix, but it's also how we get around, let's call them technical issues. For example, if you have a snare drum that plays a side stick that's very quiet during the verses and then hits with a full stick on the head of the drum in the choruses, there can be a pretty radical difference in volume between those two. And one way to address it is to use a little fader automation, a little volume automation, to turn the volume of the snare track up and down accordingly. So it's not just for emotional ebb and flow, it's to get consistency from a technical viewpoint as well. So here's an example of some automation that I use, and this happens to be on a vocal. This is from a real-world song, and all those little white dots and the lines between them in this vocal part, what's shown here is the entire song from start to finish, are automation moves in the volume of the vocals. So here on the group for lead vocal, that's where I do my automation. And what you'll notice is the song starts at a certain volume. After the first line, it gums up, and then it kind of goes up and down. And there's a few spots along the way where it kind of jumps up a lot and comes right back down again. And I'll show you what that stuff is in a moment. But I've probably got, 30 automation moves on a vocal in this particular song. And what's important is, this is a zooming in a little bit, you can see here that at the beginning, the left and the right-hand side of this thing, those two little things that pop up are bringing up the very ends of lines that the singer sang. And we're going to hear where I did that in a moment to sit consistently in the mix, not just across the vocal, but specifically in the context of all the other parts in the mix. And that's key. You want to do your vocal automation listening to the entire mix, not soloing up the vocal or whatever the thing is you're doing the automation on. So I do a lot of that kind of stuff. Every singer has a different way that he or she finishes a note or finishes a word, and I like to bring those things up so they don't get lost in the context of the mix and buried by something else. So that's what that little close-up is showing in the middle of the song. So it's important to note that on this particular track, so this is the lead vocal group, Over on the left-hand side, I already have 2 insert effects on this vocal. I have a multiband compressor, which I happen to use. I don't always use one, but on this particular vocal, evidently, I decided a multiband compressor was the one I wanted to use. And I also have a de-esser, which, by the way, has a compressor in it. So those 2 effects, here is the multiband compressor, and you can see this is an actual snapshot of the mix going by. It's doing a fair amount of volume control as the vocals coming through before we get anywhere near the automation, but not a ton. And then over here on the other side, that little red bar you see is where the S's are being compressed and turned down in this case on the vocal track. So that's more compression. So I've got actually 2 different types of compression happening before I do my vocal rides, my vocal automation, but not a ton of it. And that's the key. You'll notice the ratio of the compression here is not that big in any of the bands that are being compressed. So we're not trying to smash the vocal or modify the vocal radically with compression in order to get its level consistent. We get it to sit nice and smoothly in general, maybe get a little bit of mojo going there with a particular compressor we use for sound, but then we do the real work in automation. So that's where we get back to this. This happens after the compression that we've done on the vocal. And this will be the difference between a vocal sounding totally natural and being like just a dead anchor right smack in the middle of your mix that you never ever lose focus on. And it's all done by doing this stepped or stacked approach with a little bit of compression on the beginning and then vocal automation on the end. And this can apply again to any part, any instrument, any vocal, whatever, but it's particularly important for lead vocals. Before we go on to the next one, I want to play you a little bit of audio of that example. By the way, the screenshots I had before were from Cubase, where the actual mix was done. For illustration in this class, I'm purposely using something that's not my DAW so that nobody gets hung up in what button I'm pushing and how I'm making adjustments and all that kind of stuff. This is the finished result we're going to listen to. I just happened to bring it up in Steinberg's Wavelab, which is my mastering program of choice, and that's where the mastering got done on this song. But I'm able to solo up some stuff very, very easily in Wavelab here, and so you can hear the progression of the process as we go. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the vocal here. So down here at the bottom, we're listening to this track down here, and we're listening to the lead vocal with all of its processing on it, the compression, the de-essing, some reverb and what have you, but no vocal automation yet. So here it is without the automation rides, without the fader rides.
And I heard the welcome sound of a honky-tonk saloon.
All right, pay particular attention to this next section.
Been on the road some time for what I cannot say. Time in a cowboy bar, there ain't a better way. Whiskey, beer, and cigarettes, sawdust on the floor.
All right, so that little section right there, we need to hear what the music is doing then. So that's this track up here at the top. This is the instrumental that's behind that vocal, all by itself, no vocal. So we've got an upright bass, we've got some drums, we've got a couple guitars in there that are happening underneath the vocal. So what we want to do is make sure that we don't lose the nuance of the vocal in the band. So I want to play that section again. This is the track we're listening to now, is soloed up vocal, but with the vocal rides going on.
Been on the road some time for what I cannot say. Time in a cowboy bar, there ain't a better way. Whiskey, beer, and cigarettes, sawdust on the floor.
So where he says the word floor, that might get lost in the mix if we don't do a little automation on there. Let's hear the next line.
Ain't never been in a good one that I wanted to leave, like a man on death row who just got a reprieve. With a big old grin, I walked in the door.
Same thing there with door and that little breath at the end of it. So here here it is before we actually added the automation to the end of that line.
With a big old grin, I walked in the door.
So you can kind of hear him trailing off on door there, as opposed to this, where we actually added the automation to bring up the or part of door. And listen to how much clearer it is.
Got a reprieve with a big old grin, I walked in the door.
So he kind of says door, and on the or part of it is where we brought up the level. Right now, we're going to listen to that little piece without any vocal rides in it in the context of the mix with the rest of the instruments or the rest of the parts.
Ain't never been in a good one that I wanted to leave. Like a man on death row, just got a reprieve. With a big old grin, I walked in the door.
So the end of that door kind of got lost a little bit. And now we're going to hear it with the full band in there and the fader moves applied.
Been on the road some time for what I cannot say. Time in a cowboy bar, there ain't a better way. Whiskey, beer, and cigarettes, sawdust on the floor.
So not only do you hear the or, but you hear that little tiny breath at the end of it. And that is the difference between a really, really polished vocal mix and one that's 90 whatever percent of the way there, but doesn't keep that rock solid focus of the listener's attention the whole time. So that's an example for technique number 1 of vocal fader writing. So let's move to technique number 2. All right, primary mixing tool number 2 is to deal with stereo panning. So not only do we have the ability to change the levels of every track, the volume levels of every track, we also have the opportunity to change the placement of each track or each part within the stereo field of the mix. That's center, left, right, and everywhere in between. So a lot of times panning is also called placement from a mix perspective. And we want to do the same thing we did with the volumes. We want to get the relative positions or relative placement of each part or each section, like the horn section or the keyboard section, whatever the case may be. And a good way to do this is to imagine a bunch of players on a virtual stage. And so when you're staring at the stage, they're not all in one line in front of the drummer with the vocalist singing at the front of the line. You've got the drummer in the back and the bass player probably off to his side or her side a few feet. The singer probably up front in the center, but the keyboard player, the guitar player, they might be left or right of the stage. If you've got multiple guitars, you might have the 2 guitarists on either side and so forth. So a great technique to use is this idea of a virtual stage when deciding where to place all of your parts to start your mix. When it comes to orchestral stuff, there's a pretty well-established norm that people use for putting the violins and the woodwinds and so forth. So it might depend on the genre of music, and none of this is required, but if you're looking for a place to start, I really recommend the notion of a virtual stage for a live band. And we don't want to do a lot of radical changes here in moving things throughout the mix from one place to another if they do happen to move, because again, we don't want to distract the viewer of the scene, particularly in film and TV, but they should enhance or reinforce that ebb and flow. We just don't want to get too radical with moving stuff around in the stereo field because we have automation. I've heard a lot of mixes that kind of lose their broadcast quality because there's just too much cuteness, too much trickiness of jumping things around in the stereo field. It's more about subtlety and getting things set up in the right place to begin with. So let's talk about a great example of this using stereo panning. We have this psychoacoustic phenomenon in our brain that says the further to the left or the right that we send something in the stereo spectrum, the more our brain is able to localize it. So we're able to hear it, to find it better, even if its volume doesn't change, if it's not dead center, especially if there's a lot of other stuff happening in the center. So a lot of times, particularly if you're trying to change volume levels between things and that one part you've got just won't stand out, it gets muddied up or buried every time, no matter what volume you put it at, the first thing you might want to reach for is the pan knob, and try moving it to the side, somewhere between center and far left or far right. And all of a sudden you'll notice, bang, it just pops out, and all of a sudden you're able to find it, you're able to localize it, you're able to listen to it discreetly. A lot of times that's more effective than trying to crank the volume. Now, I've noticed over the years that there are sort of 3 points at which we start to really notice a change in where something is positioned. The first one is, of course, dead center over to about 32% of the way. Once we get over about 32% of the way, we can really tell in our ears, we notice that something is off to the side there, and it starts to pop out. Then there's another range from 32 up to about 62% of the way. And when you get over at 62, it's more noticeable in a different way than at 32%. And then the rest goes from 62% to 100% or hard left and right. When we put things hard left and right, then they not only are more noticeable, more discernible, but they kind of become anchors for that side of the stereo spectrum, the left or the right in the mix. So that's sort of a different phenomenon as far as these 3 zones go, all the way on either side. Now, because of the way we do perceive sound and the way we localize things, a lot of times after you've done some panning of something away from the center, you'll probably have to iteratively go back and change its volume. Probably turn it down because it appears, it seems louder to us now that our brain can find it more easily. This also depends a little bit on a geeky thing called the pan law and how that's set within your DAW. But that's less important than just using your ears, and after you've done the panning, make sure that the volume isn't too loud now for that part because it's so noticeable. So here's a great example that I use all the time, and that's when I have 2 guitar parts that are very similar to one another. We're trying to do some layering, some reinforcing of a sound, and so we'll have an acoustic guitar part that's played twice, for example. So in this case, I've got a shot of my folders and my individual tracks and my groups, just like I had for my lead vocal. So I've got an acoustic guitar 1, which is the second block at the top there. I have a left and a right mic on there, a neck and a body. I probably should have labeled which is which here, but I didn't. And that acoustic guitar 1 left and right are both fed into the acoustic guitar 1 group. And so that's where I make my changes as far as effects and what have you. But I use a stereo group so that I can pan the individual tracks, those left and right mics, anywhere that I want them. And then I've got a similar thing with acoustic guitar 2. It's got a left and a right mic. They go into a group for acoustic guitar 2. And I manipulate the sounds, the sonics in the group, things like compression of the part, quote unquote, which includes both mics, reverb, and stuff like that. But this gives me full flexibility on the individual tracks of where I want to pan them within the stereo field. So let's take a little look at that, what it looks like in the mixer. So what we're looking at from left to right is the 2 mics on acoustic guitar 1. Left and right, and you'll notice that they are both panned to the hard left. That's what that kind of bluish stuff is up here in the top part of the mixer. And then in the middle is the group. So the group is centered, but the tracks within the group are panned. That gives me the maximum flexibility. Similarly, over on the right-hand side, we've got the left and the right microphones for the acoustic guitar 2, feeding to its group, and both of those microphones, or both of those 2 tracks, are panned hard right, and the group is panned to the center. Again, this gives me maximum flexibility about where I want to put any track within a group. And so what we end up with, the result in the mix sonically, is we have acoustic guitar 1 way over on the left, and acoustic guitar 2 on the right, hard left and right. So let's give that a little listen here before we move on to our 3rd primary tool. So let me open this puppy up here and we'll get right to it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to first hear the acoustic guitars 1 and 2, both pan dead center. So both tracks for both guitars, the left and the right, the neck and the body mics on both guitars are panned dead center. And they sound a little bit washy. So here they are, both guitars, they're technically playing the same part at different times, They were recorded at different times, but they kind of are a big wash. All dead center. And they're both deliberately playing exactly the same part. And there's nice natural little human variations in timing and pitch between the vibration of the strings, but it's essentially the exact same part. So now we're going to listen to that part again, but this time we're going to actually hear it panned at that first of those three positions to 32% left and right. And listen to what a difference it makes in the discernment of those two parts relative to one another. So here we are. Each part panned at the 32% position, left and right. Now we're starting to be able to pick them out. In fact, I'll go back to center now. There we are in the center. Now 32. Now we're going to go full left and right. Right here, full left and right. I'm sure you'll agree that there's a pretty radical difference when they're panned left and right. We can pick out each guitar very distinctly. Not only does it sound more defined, but it actually sounds better tonally. It's a little less muddy. A little less of that big 300 cycle thing going on at the whole of the guitar and the body, and we pick up a nicer balance of the neck mic and the body mic, and a little bit more of the high end on each mic. So something as simple as splitting parts apart using your stereo panning can make a really, really radical difference in the sound that you get out of a mix. And again, that can happen with any parts, not just two guitars playing the same thing. The one thing I forgot to show you so far was what it sounds like in context. So we've heard the individual tracks of the two guitars, left and right and in the center and so forth, and what a difference that makes. But here we're going to play the instrumental part, or rather the instrumental version of the mix, and we're going to do the same thing with them panned accordingly. So here we are with the acoustic guitars panned in the center. I'm going to start over here, kind of where we did before. Acoustic guitars in the center. So now they're 32. We can find them a little better. Now, full left, right. And here we are with the vocal and everything else in there.
Reason to smile.
So what I find really interesting is when we get to that solo section, those two acoustic guitars are really, really anchoring the left and the right side of the mix super well. Had they been panned in the middle or somewhere much closer to the middle, you would not have gotten that nice contrast between them and the electric rhythm and the electric lead guitar there. So hopefully that gives you a good illustration of just what an enormous difference a little subtle panning can do for you. All right, let's get to primary mixing tool number 3, tone shaping, also known as EQ or equalization. Sometimes this is the only thing you need to do to a part, other than be able to hear it. And I'd say also pan it. What a lot of people do a lot of times is they'll try to do a bunch of funky plugins or a ton of compression or lots and lots of reverb or something on the part to kind of make it stand out or have mojo or work well in the mix, but they don't reach for the EQ, which is really where the problem is. A lot of times, if we can't hear a part well or it's not really singing well, as I like to say when I'm mixing, it's because we haven't brought out its really prominent frequencies that give it its character, or just as importantly, maybe more importantly, we haven't decreased those frequencies that work against it, like muddiness and that kind of thing. So a lot of times, if you can use some judicious EQ, sometimes even radical EQ, but that usually isn't necessary, on a part, it'll sit really, really well in the mix with no other changes. So what we want to do when we set things up for panning is we want to kind of give each section or each part its sort of own zone in the stereo spectrum. We want to do the same thing with EQ. We want to let certain parts dominate or own a frequency range. So the kick drum, for example, usually resonates at around 50 or 60 cycles. That's where its essence of its, at least its low end tone is, and it might have some other tone way up at the 8 or 10K range for when the beater hits the skin. But the primary function of a kick drum is to give us that solid 50 or 60 cycle punch at the bottom. And then above that, some of the dominant frequencies of a lot of bass guitars are right around 100 cycles. So you've got, or 100 hertz. And so you've got the kick drum here at 50 or 60, and then you've got the bass guitar up at 100 and above. And so not only do they kind of own different frequencies, so we can hear them well in the mix, but they don't argue over the same frequencies. So we haven't boosted both the bass and the kick drum at, say, 75. So then they end up fighting for frequencies, and it's hard for our brains to figure out kind of who's on first in a particular frequency range. So there's no absolutes here, but it really helps to kind of think in terms of giving the lead vocal, the guitar, the keyboard, the drums, the various parts of the drum kit, including the kick, the bass guitar, their own like little zone to own where there are certain frequencies where they dominate, and that might even mean turning down other frequencies that they have to stay out of other parts' way. So speaking of which, we were talking about two acoustic guitar parts before being panned hard left and right. Sometimes we do the panning hard left and right, and the parts are so similar that we still don't really hear them differently. So a great example of this is two electric guitars in a rocky kind of mix, a rockin' mix. And when they get panned hard left and right to do this anchoring thing, they still sound like one part. They're just not distinct enough. And this is where we can reach for the EQ to make a further differentiation between the two parts. And we call this EQ flipping or EQ splitting. There's lots of different names for it. But anyway, we have two guitars, and what we do is we boost a frequency somewhat arbitrarily, I'll show you in a minute, on one of the guitars, and we cut another frequency, we turn it down. And then on the other guitar, we do exactly the opposite. The two individual guitar parts, when soloed up, might sound really crappy or really weird when they're soloed up because of this sort of arbitrary boosting and cutting of frequencies. But that's not important. What matters is how they sound in the context of the mix. And so we do a flip, a mirror image of what we did on one guitar with the other one, and pop, they just come out of the mix and live in their own EQ zone and solve the problem of them kind of washing together. And again, you can do this between a keyboard and a guitar part that were played very similarly, that have similar frequencies coming out of them, or maybe are hitting the notes or the chords on the same time and what have you. If you use this EQ flipping or EQ splitting, you'll get a similar type of result. All right, so here we have our two electric guitars. This is exactly the same setup we used for our two acoustic guitars in the previous example. This is a different song, but we've got electric guitars folder, and in that we've got an electric guitar 1 and a copy of electric guitar 1. In fact, this particular example, this is exactly the same part. So it was literally a copy of something that was played. It wasn't played again by the same person. So they're really identical. So if you take them both and pan them dead center, they're going to sound a certain way. And then depending on the pan law in your DAW, when you pan them both hard left and right, like we did with the acoustic guitars, they'll sound totally mono, as if they were panned to the dead center. The volume might change slightly, but they will not sound at all like they're coming from opposite sides. So a little trick we have when we don't have the option of playing a part again to use this EQ flipping technique is we do a little bit of an offset of a couple of milliseconds on one of the parts. Now the key here, actually we want to do it to both parts. The key here is to maintain the rhythmic tempo center of the song. What a lot of people do is they'll take one of the parts and they'll leave it normal in terms of the time it's played back, and the other one they'll put several milliseconds ahead or behind. But what that does is that means one of the guitars is in time and one is out of time. So what I like to do is I will move one slightly forward, half as much ahead of the beat, and one slightly backwards by the same amount behind the beat, and they tend to wash at the same tempo center as they were before they were offset. So that's a little insider trick you can do if you're going to use this technique. So once again, to review really quickly, exact same part, copied the set of tracks onto a different set of tracks, exactly the same. We pan them hard left and right, and then we use a little bit of an offset to have them come out at slightly different times. But here's the EQ flipping. But before we get to that, let's give a listen to what those guitars sound like with no EQ flipping and no offset. So they're panned hard left and right, but I'll bet they're going to sound like they're one part dead center. Here we go. Yep, sounds like one part dead center. So the next thing we want to do then is we want to do no EQ flipping yet, but we want to solo up now. This is the exact same part of the two guitars, hard left and right, but we've added the offset to them now. So we're getting a little bit of difference. There's a little phasing going on, the way we happen to have it set up at this particular way. And this is something that I listen for when I'm using this technique, is whether things are wonky phase-wise, and I might move it another millisecond or two in either direction to get around phasing problems. But this is for illustration about offsetting and EQ flipping, so we won't get too geeky about that right now. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have only the EQ flipping, but no offset. So this means that we have taken the EQ of each guitar, and we have arbitrarily taken a frequency, a set of frequencies, and here they are. So what we did on guitar 1, which is at the top, is we have boosted around 1100 cycles, and we have cut at around 3500 cycles. And then on the second guitar, the copy, we have done exactly the opposite. So we have cut at 1100 cycles, and we have boosted at 3500-ish. Now you'll notice by not exactly the same amount each case, that's fine. But what we're doing is we're emphasizing and de-emphasizing exactly the opposite frequencies in each guitar track. So let's go back now and listen to only the EQ flipping. So this is where we haven't got the offset. All we've done is done the opposite EQ change for each guitar on opposite sides. Well, it sounds a little fuller there because we're doing two different EQs. And here we'll go back and we'll listen to it. No EQ flipping, and then I'll go back. So here it is, no EQ flipping. And with EQ flipping. So that made a pretty big difference. So the last thing we're going to do now is we're going to put the offset back in, and we're going to do the EQ flipping as well. And I'll switch to that in real time while it's going by here. No offset. With offset. After I've made these adjustments with the offsets and the EQ flipping, I'll go back and still level a little bit more, maybe adjust those milliseconds a little bit for the offset. But there's no doubt that it sounds much more like two distinct parts now, instead of when they were both exactly the same and panned hard left and right. So here we are with all the changes. And here they are as they started. It's pretty dead sounding. There we go. Once again, I can hear a smidge of phasing going on there, which I would adjust a little bit more. Now I realize what I did. I deliberately changed the panning a little bit in the final mix because I liked where each guitar was sitting based on those frequencies that were dominant and not dominant at the time. So let's hear it now in the context of the mix. This is just the instrumental with all that stuff applied. That's holding up pretty nicely there with that guitar. I can definitely feel it twice in there, even though only one guitar was played. And here we are with the full mix with the vocals in there.
Maybe it's time to throw caution to the wind, 'cause there are places I wanna go, and I am trying to tune in.
So there's a lot of other parts in there, which again explains why I ended up panning them, rather changing their levels the way I did. So hopefully this will at least illustrate the concept to you and make it clear enough to have you want to try this in your own mixes, especially when you don't have the luxury of playing the part twice, or as in this case, all these tracks were not recorded by me. I received them from somebody else to do a mix, and I kind of had what I had to work with, and I really missed having a second electric guitar, so that's how I approached that one. All right, moving right along to tool number 4 here, we're going to get into dynamics control, also known mostly as compression and limiting. And I think if I had to pick one thing that is a dead giveaway of a not broadcast quality mix, it's that it's too much compression all done at once rather than compression done in stages, kind of squashes the mix and sucks all the life right out of it. And we intimated a little bit about that when we were talking about doing volume automation in addition to compression. But there are a lot of spots along the way where compression happens when we're doing a mix. We have the input side on the recording itself. We have each individual track. If we use a technique like I do with groups or auxes or buses, we may have compression there. We may have compression on the master bus or the stereo master in the mix, and we might even have more compression that takes place in mastering. So if we try to get the mastered sound or the compressed sound that we want right from the beginning, right up front, it's going to be far too much applied when we have all this chance to do it gradually throughout all those steps I just mentioned. So we reach a point where we add more and more compression. The idea of compression in general, there are many other purposes, but one of the main purposes of compression is to add a little punch, a little excitement, a little forcefulness. But we hit this point where it's more punch, more punch, more punch, and then bang, we fall off this cliff and reach a law of diminishing returns where the more we compress something at a given stage, the more life goes out of it. So this is how we get around that problem. We compress in multiple steps. rather than doing everything in one place all at once. So if we have something like a lead vocal or a guitar or a snare, instead of on the snare or the lead guitar or the vocal track, compressing, let's say, at a ratio of 10 to 1, and the threshold very, very low, which means essentially we're compressing at 10 to 1 all the time. Instead, we compress at 3 to 1, maybe even with a higher threshold, so we don't compress as often on the track and maybe the group or the aux or the bus that track goes to, and then maybe there's a little bit more compression on everything in the stereo master. And we'll end up with a much, much smoother sound without really having to do a ton more work. Again, we want our mix to be to breathe and connect emotionally with the end listener, and this really helps us get there. So the example I'm gonna play for you now has lots and lots of compression going on. This is actually on my console. So I had this particular track coming in through my console, which happens to be a Yamaha O2R96, and I've got a compressor, the one in the lower left there, and I'm doing a threshold at -8, which is very high on a track. And I am doing a ratio of 2.5 to 1, which is not much compression at all. So that's actually happening at the console. That goes on the track that comes into the software and it goes onto the file. I can't take that out once it's done. But that's my first level of compression on the vocal track. Next, on the lead vocal track, we saw this before in a previous example. I happen to use a multiband compressor and a de-esser, both of which are types of compressors. That other compressor that's in the middle there that's grayed out on the left isn't being used. It's not on. So here again, we have the multiband compressor and we have the de-esser. But I'm not doing any radical compression here. Again, I'm not going over 5 to 1 ratio. And my threshold here is a little more aggressive. I've got a threshold between -15 and -28 dB decibels on this particular track, and for the style of song, that will be an important factor, but that's what I decided on here. And I have a pretty aggressive de-esser on this track as well, but that's doing some more compression on the vocal. And I also happen to have in mastering on this particular song, I'm using a compressor, a vintage style compressor here. That's got a pretty mild ratio of 1.5 to 1. That's on the whole mix, and a threshold of -23 dB, which is not super low. And you'll notice that I'm not doing a massive amount of compression here. That's the red couple of bars on the left side of the screenshot here. That's when I'm compressing. That's about how much I'm doing. So it's just a few dB of compression. You'll see on the scale there, it's at -2.7. So I'm compressing not quite 3 dB of my mix in mastering. And then last but not least, I even have a limiter in mastering, which is just a little tiny bit. It's right up at 0.1 dB for the threshold, which means it's barely compressing at all, barely limiting at all, and the threshold is set at -8-ish, which is very high. So I'm just making sure that the peaks in the mix don't jump out quite too much. But this limiter is yet another form of compression. So we had the console, we had the multiband compressor, we had the de-esser, we had the compression in the mastering, and then the limiting in the mastering. So that's 5 or 6 different stages of compression rather than smashing the living daylights out of the lead vocal right from the beginning. So let's take a quick look at that. Let me open up this guy. All right, so we're going to start out by listening to the vocal with no compression throughout the audio chain. So whatever compression is on this vocal is the compression that came in from the console, from the mixer, when we were recording it onto the hard drive. So here's a little bit of the vocal with a tiny bit of compression that came in when it was recorded.
Another small country bar where all the dreams are broken and only beer and whiskey are spoken. Give a girl my rodeo buckle as a token. 3 years, 4 kids, and she's gone.
So it's not a super uneven vocal to begin with. It has some dynamics later in the song. But now let's hear it with the compression that's added to the vocal now. On the vocal track, this is the multiband compressor in the de-esser. And I'll jump back and forth between that and the one we just heard so you can kind of hear a comparison. So here we are with only the compression that was on the vocal track.
Another small country bar where all the dreams are broken.
Uncompressed.
And only beer and whiskey are spoken. Give a girl my rodeo buckle.
Compressed.
As a token, 3 years, 4 kids, and she's gone.
All right, here we go. Not compressed.
Got a rusted old truck, can't find the registration.
Compressed.
Trying to make the best of a grim situation.
Now what we're going to listen to is the lead vocal with its own compression on its channel or its track, but also compression on the master bus. So this is that vintage compressor I mentioned before, but no limiter yet. So here we go with, we've got, well, let's see, we had the console, we had the track, and now we have the master bus. So that's 3 levels of compression on this vocal, relatively subtle at each stage.
Got a rusted old truck, can't find the registration. Trying to make the best of a grim situation. Got credit at the bar and the filling station. My dreams and my money both gone.
Back to none.
Gotta make a call soon, days are running out. Gotta figure out what this is all about.
Track compression.
If anyone can tell me, please give me a shout.
Bus compression.
My cell is gone, just call the bar.
Or master compression.
Can someone take me dancing just one more time?
Now you'll notice here that the vocal volume actually went down a little bit in mastering here through that compressor, and that could be a side effect of how the compressor itself is set and or a change in EQ during mastering. But we still get a little bit more smoothness out of the vocal. And then, of course, we're going to put the vintage compressor and the vintage limiter on the master bus, and here's where you're going to really hear a pretty radical difference. So here we are with just the track compression and the mastering compressor, and then I'm going to switch in the middle of it to the same thing plus the master limiter.
Got a rusted old truck, can't find the registration. Trying to make the best of a grim situation. Got credit at the bar and the filling station. My dreams and my money both gone.
Now you could probably notice a pretty radical difference, but what we end up with here is a really nice, clean, present vocal that is going to fit into the mix really, really well. So the last thing we want to hear, of course, the proof is in the pudding. We never ever listen to this stuff soloed up like this. Now let's hear that vocal in the context of the mix and listen to how it sits, like just perfectly placed and really, really clear and easy to follow the nuance of every syllable all the way through.
Another small country bar where all the dreams are broken and only beer and whiskey are spoken. Give a girl my rodeo buckle as a token. 3 years, 4 kids, and she's gone. Got a rusted old truck, can't find the registration. Trying to make the best of a grim situation. Got credit at the
That's where we started with the vocal.
Filling station. My dreams and my money both gone.
So hopefully that gives you an idea that nice gradual compression ends up putting something in a really, really great space. Now, if I was doing master bus compression and limiting while I was mixing, I might have done a little bit more automation on the vocal, what have you. But I did mastering as a separate step here, I believe, and I didn't have that luxury. So I worked with what I had, but you'll probably agree that the vocal sits quite nicely in that mix. And never gets lost and never jumps out too much. And we are up to primary mixing tool number 5 out of 5. This is to do with time-based effects, most commonly, again, reverb, delay, and sometimes chorus and flange, which are a combination of EQ and time bass and some other stuff. But anyway, primarily we're talking about reverb and delay. Now, the biggest problem I hear in this area is that people tend to add too much reverb to a part, or maybe even to a mix overall. And a lot of times it ends up being too much reverb is they're not taking into account when they add reverb to something, what else is going to happen with compression further down line, either in the mix or later in mastering. So in other words, if I have a vocal and I put a certain amount of reverb on it, it might sound really, really perfect on that track by itself in the context of the mix with reverb just on that track. But unfortunately, one of the first things that tends to come up rather dramatically when we start compressing mixes, either on the master stereo channel or in mastering, is effects, particularly reverb effects. So what might have started out as perfect placement of reverb ends up being way too much by the time the production is finished. So what do? Well, for one thing, I recommend if you set your reverb to the place where you think it's really, really good in your mix and you're really liking what you're hearing, back off on the amount of reverb about 1 to 2 dB, and it'll end up being perfect no matter what you do to that mix later. When we're focused on a vocal and we're doing that setting of the reverb, particularly if we do it soloed up, which I do not recommend unless we're just trying to dial in the sounds, we will want more reverb than there should be there. So set it where you think it should be in terms of the send to the reverb, and then just back off a dB or so. And you'll thank me later. It'll end up sitting really, really nicely no matter what happens to your mix from then on. So here's another little trick we can do with reverb. This is our pro secret number 5. Another problem that happens with reverb, because almost every reverb tends to happen across the entire mix, regardless of what's sending to it, because they're in stereo, is this big wash that happens. And things kind of get lost in the wash. And a part that was actually pretty distinct and well placed before we added reverb to it suddenly kind of gets lost. So we want the spaciousness and the effect of the reverb, but we don't want to lose the definition of that particular instrument in the mix. So once again, we want to be able to localize those parts in our brains, and one of the ways to do that is to make where the reverb happens in the stereo spectrum the exact same place that the part happens. So what I mean by that is if you take a guitar part that's, say, panned over on the left somewhere, and you send it to a stereo reverb, guess what? That stereo reverb comes out across the entire left and right spectrum of the stereo field. But if you pan the reverb itself to the same position that the dry track is coming from that's feeding that reverb, then it lives with that part, and it doesn't happen anywhere else in the stereo spectrum. So that's what I want to show you with this little example. We're going to use 2 guitars again. We have instead of using a single reverb for both of them, we create multiple reverbs, in this case 2. They can be exactly the same reverb, just 2 different instances of it. And then we assign one of the 2 guitars to each of those reverbs. So reverb 1 gets guitar 1, reverb 2 gets guitar 2, and then we pan each reverb to the position in the stereo field where the part is that feeds it. I'll show you this in a second. Now, this is twice as many reverbs, so it uses more memory and more processor, but you get a lot more clarity and you get that localization in the mix, and it gives more room for that emotional content that we're always talking about. So let's take a quick look here. So here we have a mix. This is a song I did a long, long time ago with the great Kenny Greenberg playing some of the guitar parts. And there were a lot of guitars. This was kind of a rockin' song, and we ended up having 4 electric guitar parts on it. We've got an electric guitar 1, electric guitar 2, We've got the lead guitar itself, and then we've got yet another electric, looks like rhythmish part going on. So each of the guitars has its own settings. This is guitar 1 and guitar 2, what we're going to use for this example. So the channel for guitar 1 on the top here, they're both using a UAD Fairchild compressor, nice gritty compressor for electric guitars. And you'll notice they're EQ'd slightly differently. I used a lot of EQ boost rather than cut in this particular mix for whatever reason, for the particular input I had at the time. But on the upper right, on the sends, you'll notice that guitar 1 goes to effect 3, reverb for guitar 1. And on the bottom, guitar 2 goes to effect 4, reverb for guitar 2. So 2 different reverbs, 2 different guitar parts, 2 different sends. Anyway, last but not least, here is what each of the reverb setups looks like. So each reverb channel has a reverb inserted in it, and in this case, I guess I use the the Reverence reverb from Steinberg that comes with Cubase, and the LA Studio setting and whatever modifications I made to that. So each of those reverbs that we saw for guitar 1 and guitar 2 are basically this setup. The Reverence reverb with the LA Studio preset, and then whatever modifications I made to that. So let's take a look here. Up at the top of the mixer screen, you'll see here that the group for electric guitar 1 is going to effect 3, and that the group for electric guitar 2 is going to effect 4. So those are the 2 that we're focusing on in this example, and then there's some other stuff further on the mix. The panning of electric guitar 1 and electric guitar 2, the individual tracks are panned to the left and the right. So the first 3 tracks, electric guitar left, right, and room, are panned left. And then we skip the group for that, and then the next 3 white ones are panned to the right. Electric guitar 2, left, right, and room. Those are probably a dynamic mic, a ribbon mic, and a condenser, a tube condenser probably. So I blended the 3 mics together into a group, just like I do with acoustics and everything else, and then I pan each element within that group accordingly. So guitar 1 is panned to the left, guitar 2 is panned to the right, and then you can see these are the 2 reverbs in the center of this screenshot. Reverb 1 for guitar 1 is panned to the left, and the reverb for guitar 2 is panned to the right. So they are not coming out of the opposite channels at all. You're only hearing those reverbs hard left and right. So let's give that a listen quickly to these guitars by themselves. Here's guitar 1 over on the left-hand side. All right, so that's guitar 1. Here is guitar 2 over on the right-hand side. It's a cleaner guitar sound, not playing exactly the same thing as guitar 1. And just for grins, let's see what the lead and the guitar 4 are doing here. All right, so that's the lead. These are all totally dry, by the way. No reverb yet. And here's guitar 4. So he's playing big diamonds over there on one side. So that's what the individual guitars sound like on their own. Now, here we're going to hear the rhythm guitars. So this is guitar 1 and guitar 2. Perhaps guitar 4 is in there. But this is what they sound like together with their stereo panning. Dry. And last but not least, let's hear those guitars with a little bit of lead thrown in there so we can kind of see where things are relatively panned in the mix. So that's a lot of guitar content to blend into a mix here. So that was the challenge of why we had to do this panning of the reverbs that we needed to do in order to make this mix work. So now we're going to hear from the top what it sounds like with those guitars with their reverbs panned to where each guitar lives.
My mama's car, the crowded parking lot. Two teenagers finding out makes each other high.
So I don't know about you, but I've got my headphones on here, and I can definitely hear the reverb of each of those guitars floating along with the part. But there's no wash. There's no squish of reverb everywhere because each of those reverbs has been panned accordingly. We obviously can only cover so much in the time we have here, so if you are interested in learning more about this stuff, you can find my Fett's Mixing Roadmap book on Amazon.com. And if you're really a glutton for punishment, you can take my Mixing Mastery online course, which you can take anywhere from any time. It's 100% self-paced. It's video-based. You can download all the videos and all the other materials, all the tracks I provide for you to mix, so you don't even have to come up with anything for that. So you can keep them forever, and that's available at mixingmastery.com. So that is my story, and I hope it was educational for people, and I'd love to have everybody go try out all these techniques at home in your own studio and hopefully help you come up with much, much better mixes. Well, that about wraps it up for me, folks. I hope you've had half as much fun watching this class as I did putting it together. I look forward to more prequel classes here, and of course the main part of the road rally as well. If you want more goodies from this class, stuff I couldn't include here, go to azaleamusic.com/taxi2020. That's AZALEA music.com/TAXI2020. I've got all the PowerPoint slides for this class, which you're welcome to download. I've also got a much longer version of it, unedited, the video, which I've got a link to there. And I might even have an exclusive discount or two for Taxi members only, attendees of this particular rally and who stuck around to watch this class. So you might want to check out that page, azaleamusic.com/taxi2020. Do good, be kind, and I look forward to seeing you hopefully in person sometime soon.